Welcome everyone to Fire, Fragmentation, and Prairie Plant Conservation. Thank you for bearing with us for just a couple of minutes as we got our speaker ready to go. A quick reminder before we get started, you can use the Q&A box on the right for your questions, and the chat function can be used for comments or discussion. Jared will address as many questions as possible in the time that we have, and for any questions that we're not able to cover, he'll be able to respond directly in the Q&A tab that you'll be able to access for up to 3 months following the conference. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Jared Beck, a postdoctoral research scientist at the Chicago Botanic Garden. His research investigates how fire and habitat fragmentation influence plant populations, plant communities, and plant-insect interactions. Jared, I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation and rejoin you afterwards for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. All right. Just want to make sure that everyone can hear me and that you can see my screen.
You're good to go.
Excellent. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction. It is my absolute pleasure to be with you all this morning and to share a little bit about my research. The work I'm going to be talking about today, I'm up here presenting, but I wanted to start by saying that this work would not have been possible without the hard work and dedication of members of Team Echinacea, the Echinacea Project. And this includes dozens of high school students, undergraduate students, recent college graduates, high school teachers, my colleagues at the Chicago Botanic Garden and the University of Minnesota. Funding for this research was primarily supported by the National Science Foundation with some additional funding from the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And I also want to thank partners, especially the landowners who gave us permission to conduct this research and helped coordinate. So that includes the Nature Conservancy, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and especially the many private landowners that we were working with. To give you a sense for where we're going to be headed today, have a little roadmap here. And so I'm going to start by providing a little bit of background just to make sure that everyone in the audience is on the same page. And next, I'm going to transition to taking a detailed look at what's happening in prairie plant populations. Third, I'm going to take a look at the role of fire in these fragmented landscapes. And finally, I want to take a little bit of time to take a step back and think about the future of plant conservation in prairies. To get us started, one of my favorite parts about presenting to the prairie enthusiasts is there's such a diverse range in the audience, from folks who just learned about prairie a couple weeks ago or even a couple days ago, to natural resource professionals who have been working in these systems for decades. And so just to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page, this may be a review for some folks, but I just want to provide a little bit of background. Prairie composed extensive grasslands that stretched across central North America 200 years ago. If you look at this map on the right, you can see we tend to divide these grasslands into short grass, mixed grass, and tall grass prairie, with tall grass prairie in this kind of pink salmon color on the easternmost edge. And you guessed it, the way we define tall grass prairie is by the dominance of a lot of these tall grasses. And even though grasses are kind of the central feature that we use to identify and distinguish these different landscapes, I think about it as a grassland that's absolutely filled with wildflowers. And we tend to think about prairie, some people have this impression that it's this big, flat extent of grass, and there are certainly prairies that look like that. This is a wet prairie complex in northwestern Minnesota that's in the glacial lake, the bed of glacial Lake Agassiz, and it's pretty much dead flat apart from all these beach ridges. But across our landscape, we also have these rolling hills that historically supported prairie. And if you look closer, you see that those hills are covered in a diversity of plant species. It's incredible textures and colors that shift over the course of the summer. And because I think in February we could all use a little bit of color in our lives, I went ahead and took the liberty of sharing some photos of the friends that we make while we're out in the prairie. So it's this incredible diversity of herbaceous plants, these flowering plants, that really sticks out to me as what I associate with prairie. And that's what a lot of my talk is going to focus on today, is these plants that characterize this incredible landscape. Unfortunately, today, it's pretty hard to find these patches of prairie and find a lot of these plants that I'm showing pictures of. And that's because the vast majority of the prairie that existed on the landscape 200 years ago is gone. I do most of my work right now in Minnesota, and Minnesota is pretty typical when it comes to what has happened to prairie across the upper Midwest. This map on the right shows the state of Minnesota. Don't worry about all the text. What I want you to focus on is yellow. That's the extent of tallgrass prairie in Minnesota 200 years ago at the time of the General Land Survey. 18 million acres. What's left today is shown in red, and what I'll notice is the people who made this map put big buffers around the remnant prairies so you could actually see them on this map. Less than 1%, less than 200,000 acres of Minnesota's original 18 million acres of prairie remains today. And the concern for conservation isn't just that we're losing prairie habitat. It's that when we go to these small places on the landscape, the places that still support prairie, we find that they're losing species and they're changing very quickly. Probably our best insight into how these communities are changing comes from Wisconsin, where we have this unique data set where researchers visited prairies in the 1950s, recorded all the plant species they found, and researchers subsequently went back in 1987 and 2012 to do the same, making a list of all the plant species they found. And what they found is that plant species diversity is declining rapidly, and we're losing our native prairie plants at an alarming rate. Between 1950 and 1987, the researchers estimate that on average, prairie remnants were losing about one native plant species every 2 years. And between 1987 and 2012, they estimate that the pace of change accelerated to more than one species per year. So what factors are responsible for the loss of native plant diversity in these remnants? The big one is fire. And if you tuned into Dan's talk this morning, you heard a little bit about why fire plays such an important role in prairies, savannas, and woodlands of North America. This is a painting from George Catlin showing a prairie fire burning on bluffs along the Mississippi River. This is in northeastern Iowa. And frequent fire was an essential part of prairie. And fire happened as a combination of naturally lightning-caused fires that spread across the plains, and especially the widespread use of fire by indigenous communities in North America. We find that in order for prairies to maintain diversity, they often need fire. And indeed, in that study from Wisconsin, researchers found that prairies that were burned tended to maintain their plant diversity, while prairies that didn't burn tended to lose diversity. The story about fire goes hand in hand with changes on the landscape. This is kind of a schematic showing how forests in western Wisconsin changed over time. The extent of forest is shown in green. And this is pretty much identical to what we see happen in prairies. We're losing total area of that habitat, and the patches of habitat that remain are small and isolated from one another, what we call habitat loss and fragmentation. And what this looks like on the landscape, this is a pretty typical landscape in western Minnesota, is I have an arrow pointing to a little prairie remnant. It's surrounded by fields, and you can see some lakes in the area. And what we see is that small patches of prairie tend to lose species at a faster rate than large patches of prairie. My goal in my research is to go beyond just these patterns of how plant communities are changing and take a detailed look at the lives of plants and why these changes are happening. And so my work, I take a demographic perspective. And what this means is that I'm trying to investigate the different aspects of a plant's life cycle, shown here by this lovely little cartoon for elementary school students or middle school students. And so I'm thinking about the factors that are influencing different plant life stages, ranging from the germination of seeds, the growth of seedlings, the survival of plants, and in general, the growth, survival, and reproduction of plants. And my work over the past 4 years has primarily focused on 6 species. I'm not going to talk about Western Prairie Fringed Orchid, which is a federally listed species today, but I am going to talk a little bit about these 5 that are pictured here. So going from left to right, we have the purple coneflower, Echinacea angustifolia, rough blazing star, Laetris aspera, big blue stem, Andropogon gerardii, green milkweed, Asclepias viridiflora, and on the right we have prairie lily or wood lily, Lilium philadelphicum. And so today I'm going to share a few stories in the field that kind of, from my research, investigating what's happening in these plant populations over time. And a lot of the talk and what I'm going to start with is focused on the pale purple coneflower, Echinacea. This is the species that my research group has been working on for a long time. And it's the species where we have the best insights into the factors that are influencing plant growth, survival, and reproduction in our fragmented prairies. So just taking a step back and letting you have a chance to get to know Echinacea. This plant species is widespread west of the Mississippi River, so you won't see it in southern Wisconsin or northern Illinois, but once you get west of the Mississippi River, you have a chance to pick it up. We're working in western Minnesota, which is, this plant is common. It's long-lived. It lives a long, long, long time, many decades. And even though it lives for such a long time, it doesn't flower every year. It's self-incompatible, meaning that in order to successfully produce seed, it has to receive pollen from an unrelated individual, an unrelated plant, in order to produce seed. It's not clonal, so it only reproduces via seed. It has a big taproot that goes down several meters into the ground, and it's pollinated by a set of generalist pollinators, primarily ground nesting solitary bees. To get a sense for the life cycle of Echinacea, I have kind of this graphical representation here, and I'll walk you through it. So starting off in the top left, we have seedlings. So seedlings that emerge survive at some rate to become juveniles. And so for 5 years after a seedling emerges, plants will not flower. And so they survive at some rate from age 1, age 2. Not every single individual survives. There's quite a bit of mortality. And once they're about 6 years old, they have a chance to flower for the first time. But it's really rare. Only like 1%, less than 1% of plants that are 6 years old flower for the first time. And they kind of continue, they can in fact stay in this juvenile stage, not reproducing for decades. Once they flower for the first time, they kind of alternate back and forth between in a given year flowering versus being basal. That is, they're not reproducing, they're just hanging out as leaves, trying to get as much energy as possible so that they can flower again. And so they kind of go back and forth between flowering and basal as adults. And when they flower the number of seeds that they contribute to the next generation depends on a few different processes that we're going to talk about, as well as how many of those seeds emerge to become seedlings. My research group does a ton of work to try to collect data on every single one of these life stages so that we can really have a detailed perspective on how likely it is that plants survive from a seedling to becoming an adult. And so we're out in prairie remnants. Some of them are pretty nice, some of them are pretty degraded, and we're out there mapping and measuring and taking data on all different aspects of the life cycle of these plants. At the end of the summer, we harvest heads. And we bring them back to our lab in the Chicago Botanic Garden, where we have this awesome group of volunteers who help us process and count the number of fruits and seeds that plants are producing. And we're working in about 40 different remnants, 40 different populations of Echinacea. And over the past 10 years or so, we've collected an immense amount of information about plants. In fact, we have collected data on almost 12,000 individual plants and almost 50,000 of those transitions from one life stage to another. And our goal is really to understand what's happening within these populations and whether populations are growing, whether they're stable, whether they're shrinking, and why. Studying this directly is really challenging. Like I mentioned, these plants live for decades. And so in order to have a perspective that's relevant to the life cycle of these plants, we'd have to be out there for 50, 60, 70 years studying the same plants to understand whether populations are growing or shrinking. And even for a research project like us, who has been out there working with these plants for decades, that's a really, really tall order. And so in order to gain insights into what's happening in these populations, we use models. And basically what we do is we take all that information that we collect on the different life stages of these plants, and we develop rules that tell us how likely it is that seedlings survive to become one-year-old juveniles, and how likely it is that one-year-old juveniles become two-year-old juveniles, survive to be 2 years old. And so we use our data to develop all these different rules governing the transition from one life stage to another. And we take all those rules and we put them together in the computer, and we can simulate what's most likely to happen in these populations. And so what I'm going to show you is some new work from these models that help us understand, get a really detailed perspective for what's happening in our Echinacea populations. I'm going to show you two different graphs. On the left, I'm going to show you how quickly the population is growing. And all you need to know on the left is that that dashed line at 1 corresponds to the rate of growth that we'd expect if populations are stable. So if populations are stable, they're staying the same over time, we'd expect the populations to sit right at that line at 1. If they're growing, it's going to be greater than 1. If they're declining, it's less than 1. On the right, I'm going to show you the probability that the population persists 100 years into the future. So if it's guaranteed that that population is going to persist, you'll see a value that's right around 1. And if it's very likely that that population will go extinct in 100 years, you'll see a value right around 0. And the first model output that I'm going to show you is a hypothetical scenario. And that hypothetical scenario is if population size doesn't matter whatsoever. So starting on the left, if population size has no influence on how likely plants are to survive and reproduce and grow, here's what we'd expect. We'd expect that on average, populations are going to decline by about 2% every single year. And if you go to the right, you'll see that when populations start with more than 16 sexually mature plants, that it's very likely that they're going to persist 100 years into the future. But as populations get really, really small, that probability of persistence goes way down. Next, I'm going to show you what we actually observe. So this is using our data from these Echinacea populations and showing, based on the survival and growth that varies across these different population sizes, what we'd expect. And so I want you to ignore the purple and green lines for the moment and just focus on the black line here. This is what we observe. So if we start way up at the top end here, when we have 2,000 or 4,000 sexually mature plants to start, those populations are basically stable. So on average, they're going to sit right around the same total population size. But you see that as we start with fewer and fewer plants, populations are declining. When you get down to starting with 4 or 8 sexually mature plants, we expect that on average, those populations are declining by 7 or 8% per year. Gulp. Now, if we look at the right, when we look at the probability of persistence, and if you take a look at that black line, what you see is that when we account for the fact that in small populations, plants are less likely to reproduce, they're more likely to die. This has a big impact on the probability that those populations are going to persist 100 years into the future. In fact, it's very likely that 100 years into the future, our smallest populations are going to disappear from the landscape. So this is a little bit scary, but it provides some perspective about what's happening in these prairie plant populations. They're declining, and unless you have these huge populations, unmanaged prairie plant populations are going to decline over time. And this is due to a variety of factors. So in our models, we find that there's kind of 2 primary factors that contribute to declines in small populations. So the first one has to do with the survival of adult plants. Adults are more likely to survive in large populations and less likely to survive in small populations. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly why this is, but there are a few factors that could be at play. So one is just kind of unrelated to population size itself, but has to do with things like habitat quality. Our smallest populations are often in roadsides and severely degraded remnants, where just because of the environmental conditions, they may be less likely to survive. There are also some factors that have to do with the population size itself. So there are kind of evolutionary threats. Genetic drift and inbreeding depression are questions that my colleagues work on a lot. And those are factors that could lead plants in small populations to decline more quickly. There's also just chance events in small populations that may make them more vulnerable to local extinction. So there are a whole host of things that can influence plant survival. There's also a second factor that we looked at, which is a little bit surprising, and that's the prospects of finding a mate. So in plants, the number of seeds that a plant contributes to the next generation depends on a few different processes. So in a long-lived plant like Echinacea that doesn't flower every year, the number of seeds that it produces kind of depends first and foremost on whether or not that individual flowers in a given year. If it flowers, how many heads is it producing? How many fruits can potentially get pollinated? And then kind of where I'm leading up to is how likely that plant is to get pollinated. And especially in outcrossing plant species, so plant species that depend on pollen from other individuals in order to successfully produce seed, producing more heads, flowering more often, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to produce more seeds. In small populations, we often find that there's lower pollination and seed production. So on the left here, I have shown an X-ray of some Echinacea fruits. And you can think of these like sunflowers or sunflower seeds that you might buy in a bag to snack on. And most of the ones that they have in the bag are full. They have a little embryo inside, right? But every now and then you get a shell that's empty. It's kind of the same thing for Echinacea. And we see tremendous variation in the proportion of those fruits or achenes that contain an embryo. And that has a lot to do with the mating opportunities that a plant experiences. So this graph over here at the top end, when there are more than 1,000 flowering plants out there, on average, we see that about 40 to 50% of those fruits are pollinated. But when you get down to like less than 5 flowering plants in a population, we see that the proportion of those fruits that contain an embryo, the proportion that are successfully pollinated, drops down to below like 5%. And this is, kind of a story about pollination and how pollinators are moving pollen. If there just simply aren't mates out there to get pollen from, that results in lower pollination and seed production. And what we see in echinacea is actually what we see in echinacea related to pollination happens in a number of other plant species. So, for example, rough blazing star is very, very similar to echinacea. What we see is that seed set, the proportion of those fruits that contain an embryo, is greatest when there are lots of plants, other flowering ligatures nearby. And it declines as prospective mates get further and further away. Same thing goes for lilies. When prospective mates are nearby, when there's a greater density of prospective mates, there's higher proportion of ovules that contain a fertilized embryo. Taking a step back, it's very clear that plant populations are in trouble, and there are a variety of factors that are contributing to these declines. So really the next question is, what can we do about it? And you might have guessed it, but fire is an important piece of the puzzle. Returning fire to these landscapes is absolutely essential for plant conservation. Like I mentioned earlier, we have studies showing that when prairies are burned, they're more likely to maintain diversity. This is cool. As a researcher, I'm interested in digging in even more to understand why fire has these positive effects and how fire is influencing different aspects of a plant's life cycle. And fire can influence many different aspects of a plant's life cycle. If we go back to thinking about echinacea as a model, if you go through and you think about the different life stages, fire could influence seedlings, how likely seedlings are to survive. It could influence juvenile survival. It might influence how likely plants are to flower. It could even influence how many seeds they're producing. And so the primary goal of my research is to try to better understand how fire is influencing these different life aspects of the life cycle of plants. So let's start with seedlings and thinking about how fire might influence seedling recruitment. If you look carefully in this photo, you'll see, I'll point out first that we have these colored toothpicks, and every single one of those colored toothpicks is right next to an echinacea seedling. And so the eagle-eyed viewers might be able to pick out those little echinacea seedlings popping up through the litter. The number of those seedlings that we see on the landscape reflects a few different steps. So first, it depends on how many seeds have been dispersed. So echinacea produces these composite heads and produces a whole bunch, about 150 per head of these fruits, which may or may not contain a seed. And what happens is echinacea doesn't have a specialized dispersal mechanism, and so the heads just kind of flop over. And in this picture on the right, you can see an echinacea head popping out from the bottom left corner. And if you look carefully on the ground, you can see a whole bunch of little kind of triangular pyramidal shaped achenes or fruits. And if you're really looking carefully, you can even see some echinacea seedlings. So the fruits disperse in the fall, and the following spring, usually late May or early June, seedlings will emerge. And after seedlings emerge, only some of those seedlings survive over the course of the summer and into the next year. And so in order to really understand how fire is influencing the number of seedlings that are surviving, it's important to account for these different steps. And so my colleagues and I designed a seed addition experiment. And what we did is in remnant prairies, we went out and we put out a known quantity of seeds. So this photo on the left shows us putting out some seeds in an envelope. And we did this across 36 different prairie remnants and 86 randomly placed transects, so just lines that are kind of marked out by nails. And we did this across these 36 remnants, some of which had been burned recently, some of which hadn't been burned recently. And so we have this nice gradient in the time since fire that we established experimentally. In total, we sowed over 11,000 seeds, 11,057 to be precise. And I know that because I counted every single one. Um, and we scored how many of those seeds emerged to become seedlings, and there are about 1,000. And our goal was to understand how fire is influencing seedling recruitment. And so what I'm going to show you are two different graphs. On the left, I'm going to show you the rate of seedling emergence. This is the proportion of the seeds that we sowed that emerged to form seedlings. And on the x-axis, you'll see this years since fire. And what this corresponds to, a 0 corresponds to seeds that were sown in the fall. They overwintered, and then that site was burned in the spring. So burning happened after the seeds were sown. 1 year since fire corresponds, or 1 year since fire corresponds to seeds that were sown in the fall. They overwintered. Or sorry, let me take a step back. We burned the site in the spring of year 1. Plants over the summer grew this, and in the fall, we sowed seeds. And then this corresponds to seeds that emerged 1 year after that experimental burn, 2 years after an experimental burn, and then sites that haven't been burned for at least 4 years. So on the left, we're going to look at seedling emergence, and on the right, we're going to look at the probability that those seedlings survive from when they first emerged in the spring to the end of the summer. Starting with emergence, what you'll see, there's kind of this very, very low start. So if seeds are dispersed and you burn after they're dispersed, very, very few of those seedlings emerge. And this probably reflects the fact that these seeds are sitting on top of the soil. They didn't get worked into the soil. When you burn in the spring, those seeds are exposed to a whole lot of heat, and they probably just do not survive. Now, if you have seeds that are sown after a fire, emergence is variable, but is much, much higher. So in 2023, that was about 10% of those seeds that were sown emerged. And in 2024, that was almost 20%. And then you get further and further from fire, and it declines again. And so there seems to be this peak. The optimal time for seedlings to emerge is 1 year after a fire. There's kind of a similar story when it comes to the probability that they survive. We combined the 0 and 1 year since fire treatments here because all 11 of the seedlings that emerged in the 0 year since fire treatment survived to late summer. So probability of survival is highest, sitting right up around 85 to 90%. 0 or 1 year since fire. So recent fire, better seedling survival. And the more time since fire that occurs, the lower that survival gets, although there's a huge amount of variation. And this variation has to do with characteristics of the microsite, so how much litter there is and the vegetation. So it's very clear that fire has some beneficial effects for seedling recruitment. It improves the number of seeds that are emerging, and it helps them survive at a higher rate. Our goal was to do this for every single one of these life stages and kind of piece it together to understand what aspects, how fire is influencing these different life stages, and how these different life stages contribute to whether populations are growing or declining. And I think when we talk about fire in the context of prairies, there's been a lot of focus on how fire influences the physical environment for good reason. So thinking about the intensity of fire and how it's influencing the prevalence of woody plant species. thinking about the timing of fire, and how that might influence organisms that are emerging at different times. And there's good reason for that. One thing we haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about, though, is the role of fire in a fragmented landscape, and particularly whether the effectiveness of fire might depend on how big the plant populations are. And just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here, if you think back to, if we think about reproduction or how quickly populations are growing, in the absence of fire, the bigger populations are, kind of the better it is for a few of these different life stages. And when we burn, we could see that fire improves everything across the board. And so fire takes, regardless of whether populations are really small or really large, fire has this net positive effect that's similar across the board. We could also see that whether or not you burn, small populations are at a disadvantage, and fire just kind of increases survival, increases reproduction across the board similarly, but there's still this disadvantage to being in small populations. Or we could see something kind of crazy where the effectiveness of fire depends on the plant population size. And so my work over the past 4 years has been really trying to understand how the effectiveness of fire might depend on plant population size. And, so we're out there collecting data on all these different life stages. And the one I want to spend some time thinking about is plant reproduction. And for anybody who's spent time in prairie, it will not surprise you to know that after you burn, you're kind of left with this charred and blackened landscape. But in a few weeks or months, that charred and blackened landscape turns into a sea of wildflowers, turns into a sea of flowers, and many, many prairie plant species flower vigorously after fire. And one of my big questions was to understand whether the influence of fire on plant reproduction depends on population size. And so my team and I went out and we burned a whole bunch of different prairie remnants. Some were really, really, really small, and some were quite a bit larger. And we did this experimentally across the landscape, so that we have this graph kind of shows our experimental time since fire treatments across echinacea populations, ordered from the smallest populations on the bottom here to the largest populations at the top. And so in any given year, we have populations that were burned recently, populations that weren't burned recently, and we have variation in population size. We went out and we mapped every single one of those flowering echinacea plants between 2012 and 2023. That's 6,357 individuals. We monitored the daily flowering phenology. So the first and last day, each individual produced pollen. And then we harvested seed from a sample of plants to quantify how many seeds those plants are producing. And our goal was to understand how fire was influencing different aspects of reproduction in plants. So thinking generally about things like reproductive effort. So whether or not individuals flower, how many flowering heads they're producing, but then also reproductive outcomes. So how well pollinated are they, and how many seeds are they producing? So I'll start with reproductive effort. I'm going to show you two graphs. On the left, we have the proportion of echinacea plants that are flowering in a given year. And along the x-axis, we have the number of sexually mature plants in the population. That ranges from about 3 sexually mature plants all the way up to nearly 4,000. And on the right, have the average number of heads that those plants are producing. On the left, so the remnants that burned are shown in red, and then the ones that didn't burn are shown in gray. And what you'll see is that after you burn, there's about a doubling in the proportion of plants that flower. If you don't burn, 20 to 25% of echinacea flower in a given year. If you burn, it's up near 50%. Kind of a similar story for head count. When you don't burn, echinacea produce on average about 1 of those composite heads. And if you do burn, you're up to an average of near 2. And for both of these, you'll note that the effect of fire is consistent across the full range of populations. So whether you're dealing with a population that has 4 echinacea or 4,000, on average, you're seeing the same increase in reproductive effort after fire. Now let's talk about reproductive outcomes, so pollination and seed production. On the left, I'm going to show you the total number of seeds that an individual echinacea plant is expected to produce. And on the right, I'll show you seed set, which is the proportion of those fruits that get pollinated. And what we see is something that's a little bit crazy here. So in the largest population, starting off at the right, fire has a very consistent effect. Fire consistently increases the total number of seeds that a plant is producing, nearly doubles the total number of seeds. But once you get down below about 16 individual plants, the difference between burned and unburned is minimal. So it doesn't really matter whether or not a population is burned, they're producing the same number of seeds, and it's a very small number of seeds. And this all has to do with pollination. So on the right, you can see kind of a very similar pattern, where in the largest populations, fire consistently increases the number of fruits that get pollinated. But in the smallest populations, there's this this kind of threshold below about 20 individual plants where fire does not consistently benefit plant reproduction. So I've shown you kind of how fire is influencing 2 different aspects of the life cycle of echinacea. In one case, with seedling recruitment, it seems like fire is probably going to have consistent effects across the landscape. And in another, when it comes to pollination and seed production, that effect of fire really depends on population size. And so my next step is to put this all together into one of these models to better understand whether the effect of fire on populations, so whether populations are growing or declining, depends on population size. And so that's what I'm working on right now, and really trying to understand whether fire has consistent benefits across the landscape, or whether the effect of fire might depend on population size. I've talked a lot about echinacea today, so I did want to kind of wind up by sharing a little bit about a couple other species. So let's start with blazing star Laetris. Laetris is really, really similar to echinacea. In fact, it probably responds more strongly to fire than echinacea. And so what we see in echinacea is really mirrored by what's happening in Laetris, with one exception, and that has to do that there's another layer of complexity. And that's that after Laetris gets pollinated and produces seeds, it gets absolutely hammered by insect seed predators. And there might be a really interesting relationship between fire and these seed predators that we're working on. We took some of these seed predators and had them, a colleague of ours sequence them. So these are just 2 of our friends. These are both lepidopterans. Top left, we know what this one is. This is a specialist on composite flowers, a moth. And on the right, it's a moth, but we don't really know what it is yet. How about Andropogon, big blue stem, one of the characteristic species of tallgrass prairie? We went out there and across 27 different remnants, the same kind of burn mosaic across the landscape. We counted the number of culms, the number of flowering stems that plants were producing, and have done this for 4 years. And this is kind of what the data looks like in its raw form, and one of our students who's out there helping us collect data. And basically what happens is right after a fire, I know this is not surprising to anyone who's worked in prairie, but right after a fire, Andropogon goes bonkers and produces tons and tons of flowering stems. And in the years after fire, that kind of declines. So that's really old news. We really did not need to go out and collect 4 years of data to understand this pattern. The part that we're really excited about is we also harvested seed from Andropogon and are looking at the proportion of those fruits that Andropogon is producing that contain an embryo, that got pollinated and contain an embryo. And I was really hoping that I would have this data ready for prairie enthusiasts to share today, but we're not quite there. What I can tell you is there's tons and tons and tons of variation. And that from looking at x-rays, I strongly suspect that big blue stem is very similar to echinacea in terms of fire effects on pollination and seed production. But stay tuned. The last species I'm going to share a little bit about is green milkweed. And that's because it's a little bit different than some of the others that I've talked about. Again, we looked at different aspects of green milkweed reproduction. So how likely they are to flower, how many of those umbels, those flower clusters they produce, and then in their pods, how many ovules they contain. And what we found is that across the board, fire has a positive effect, although the effect on ovules is really small. So when you burn, if you don't burn, about 45% of those green milkweed plants will flower in a given year. When you burn, it's up near 80%. When you burn, they're producing on average about 3 umbels per plant. If you don't burn, it's a little under 2. Where it differs from a lot of the other species that I've talked about comes when it comes to reproductive outcomes. So after fire, plants are more likely to produce pods. They produce more pods, but they don't produce pods at a higher rate than plants that aren't burned. There's really no effect of fire on the proportion of ovules that contain embryos. And so fire has a big positive effect on the number of seeds that green milkweed is producing, but it seems to be a resource story. It doesn't seem to be a pollination story. So a few takeaway messages from the talk that I hope folks can garner from this. One is that plant populations in prairies and in fragmented habitats are declining, and they face a whole bunch of different kinds of threats. In prairies and other fire-dependent systems, fire is an absolutely vital tool. It's really important to return fire to the landscape before populations become too small and fire can no longer be an effective tool. There's kind of 2 ways to think about the work that I presented today. There's the glass half empty version, which is, ooh, things aren't looking great for prairie plant populations. They're declining, they face a lot of threats, and even our best tools, fire, may not be effective when plant populations become too small. I prefer to take the glass half full version, which is that, yes, plants are in trouble, but we have some time, especially with these long-lived species. We have a few decades, and the threshold below which fire becomes ineffective in echinacea for reproduction is like 15 or 20 individual plants. And you can get a lot of plants into a very small remnant prairie. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is just emphasizing how important these small populations and small prairies are to the future of plant conservation. I have this photo here. And if you're really sharp-eyed, you'll notice there are kind of 2 different colors of smoke. So there's a white smoke in the foreground here, and then there's a darker smoke in the background. And that's because these are actually 2 different fires that are happening in close proximity to one another. In the background, there's a 320-acre waterfowl production area that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was burning last spring. And the dark smoke comes from them burning through some cattails. In the foreground is about an 8-acre prairie remnant that we burned last spring. And these fires happened kind of simultaneously. Ours was kind of slow and smoky. And, you know, we sat there and we were thinking about it. And, you know, we realized that this 8-acre remnant prairie that we were burning probably had at least 3 or 4 times as many plant species as that 320-acre WPA that Fish and Wildlife was burning. And we kind of joked to ourselves that, you know, the 6 of us out there hauling around drip torches and backpack sprayers were probably having a bigger conservation impact in terms of plants than that big US Fish and Wildlife Service crew with all their toys. And this has been kind of a change in my perspective over the course of my work. I came in being pretty skeptical about the conservation value of these small populations. A colleague of mine reminded me of this quote from Stephen Pine, in which he compared the small remnant prairies in Illinois to hospice rooms. And I want to leave you with a thought that I just want to push back really strongly against this perspective. I think a lot of us are excited about some of the big landscape scale projects that are happening to restore prairie. So the map on the right here shows some of the areas, the long-term plans for Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan, and areas and landscapes that they'd like to restore to prairies. And these are great, but I really want to emphasize how important these small prairies and small plant populations are. You know, it's not a great model for these big clunky organizations to work on conservation in tiny little remnant prairies. But I think that's where there's a really important place for grassroots conservation efforts and organizations. Over the past 4 years, you know, our team, who's primarily doing science, I think has made a big impact on the landscape by burning some of these small populations and seeing what happens. The extant diversity, so the species, the genetic diversity that's in these small populations is simply, in these remnants, is simply irreplaceable and will be vital to the long-term success and diversity of some of these large-scale projects. And so I really want to emphasize how big of an impact a small group of people can have on the landscape. And just want to emphasize that, you know, we're working with our neighbors and forming these relationships that it can have big impacts. And, you know, I've just in the past 4 years have had some really positive experiences on this front. So with that, I want to stop myself here and open it up for questions. I'll leave this screen up here. I'm happy to answer questions in the chat throughout the conference, but I put my email up here if you want to shoot me an email to ask me a question. And I have a couple websites here if you want to learn some more about the work that's been going on.
Thank you so much, Jared. So we do have time for a few questions from the audience. And as you were kind of offering your closing remarks, I was certainly thinking about the relevance for our mission, why we exist, what it is that we do in partnership with some of these larger groups. There's a really unique place for the prairie enthusiasts. So thank you for recognizing that and giving us a chance to kind of step into the importance of what we're doing in partnership with others on that landscape. So the first question is around low intensity late autumn fire. And you talked a lot about echinacea, so specifically considering echinacea, but maybe other species as well, if you want to touch on that. We're kind of curious, like what happens with those seeds? Do the stems fall on the ground in the process of a low intensity fire? And go ahead and comment.
Yeah, I'm a little bit reluctant to comment on fall burns because we actually didn't do any fall burns in our experiment. We have a limited number of remnants to work with, and so we wanted to kind of keep the timing of fire as consistent as possible. So nearly all of our burns were as soon as we could in the spring, as soon as the snow was off the ground and temperatures were good. And so I don't have a good answer about what exactly happens if you're doing a late fall burn in some of these remnants. We could probably speculate, but unfortunately, all of our burns were in the spring.
So it looks like the 10 to 20% emergence rate seemed pretty low. Actually, let me back up for a second. So we have had some question about when we're talking about pollinators, what are we talking about? So we think about bees as like first and foremost our common pollinator that we talk about, but can you just touch briefly on what some of the other pollinator workers are in a prairie system?
Sure. little bit outside my wheelhouse, but the primary pollinators for a lot of our plant species are going to be native ground nesting bees. So a lot of them are solitary, some are semi-social. Those are probably the most important group of pollinators for prairies writ large. Um, so outside of that, we have bumblebees are important for a whole bunch of different plant species. The green milkweed that I showed, bumblebees absolutely love it. And then we have diverse lepidopterans that butterflies and moths that pollinate a number of different species. So for most of the species that I'm showing here, including lilies, it's primarily these small ground nesting bees.
Does your research take into account some of the other impacts that might be experienced by the system? So, for example, the impact of pesticides and neonicotinoids on pollinators. How does your research kind of account for what might be a reduction in some of our pollinators in the prairie?
Yeah, great question. So we have some long-term projects. I don't have results kind of at my fingertips looking at pollinator abundance over the past couple decades, which kind of overlays with the increased use of neonicotinoids across the landscape. Um, so that's something that we've kind of kept an eye on, but we actually haven't seen pollination rates in echinacea, where we have the longest term perspective, declining over time. And so that's not a one-to-one correlation with the number, abundance, or diversity of pollinators across the landscape, but we haven't seen like an absolute crash in pollination. Um, so I'm gonna herbicide use is something that I think it probably has a big impact, especially on some of these small remnants that we're working in. We have crews from the county that are out there spraying wild parsnip after parsnip is producing seed. And so they're not only not controlling parsnip, but they're also, hammering a lot of our plant species. And we've had a few populations that have gotten sprayed really heavily and disappeared as a result. And so, not pesticides, but herbicide use, I think definitely there's in a lot of these populations, the increased use of herbicide has had negative impacts.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think one of the things that I've observed is that there's a lot of connection between research and practice in agriculture, but not as tight of a connection between research and practice in restoration. So really delighted that you were here to share what's been a very long process of collecting data over many years and painstakingly counting many seeds. I'm grateful for your work. We do have some additional questions in the chat. If you get a chance to check in, we'd really appreciate that. So everyone, please join me in thanking Jared for his research and his presentation this morning. We'll see you back for the next presentation and a full day of programming here at our conference. Thank you, Jared.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.